Well, friends, our scripture lesson today is taken from the Gospel according to John, chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Well, we are complex people, and we are not rational, and there are all kinds of contradictions within us, and these contradictions play out in our lives in different ways. Like one of the things that they often talk about in leadership issues or just personal planning is that we are people who too often let the urgent get in the way of the important. When we would think that we ought to be focusing on what's important, lesser urgent things come up and they distract us, and next thing you know, you've spent an entire day not focused on what was important, but just on the little things that cropped up in an urgent way and distracted you. There are sometimes we have the ability to make big changes, and sometimes even relatively minor changes are impossible. For example, I often talk about the fact that I am a serial clutterer. All right, and I can't seem to get rid of it. No matter how many times I decide I'm going to take time and I'm going to declutter, it magically reappears. And I've gotten to the point where I'm convinced this is not my fault. All right, it has nothing to do with me. I don't know where the clutter comes from. I am blaming the objects, not myself. All right, they are just showing up in my office, and for some reason, I never get rid of it. And yet it bothers me because, sometimes little things have large ramifications in our lives. And this is a miracle story that we have today that can seem like it's really insignificant, okay? After all, what is it to run out of wine? He says, when the wine gave out, it's like, okay, but is this really the story that Jesus needs to make his appearance on, right? Okay, we're out of booze, all right? And plus even alcohol within the church these days is kind of controversial. I mean, I grew up, my parents were not drinkers. I'm not a big drinker. I consider my annual consumption of alcohol is maybe a dozen drinks, or so, in a social setting. So I'm not completely opposed to it, but it's just not a part of my life. My parents, on the other hand, when they first saw a bottle of wine at the manse, they asked me if I would be fired by the church if they saw this in the manse, because my parents are from a tradition where when I was growing up in the church, if the pastor was coming over, you hid the wine. Notice hid, not threw out. Hid. Okay, all right. What was the way we reacted? But the issue around the wine running out is that this is a matter of real embarrassment to the host. Okay, because the host is throwing a wedding. It's a really important time, in the host's family's life, and to run out of wine was a huge hospitality faux pas. And so it's really embarrassing to him. And Jesus' mother, Mary, notices this and says to Jesus, you should do something about this. At which point, Jesus gives a reply that makes me cringe every single time I read it. Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? And all I can think about is that I would not be standing here if I ever spoke to my mother that way in my life. But on a rational level, it makes a certain amount of sense because he's saying, look, this isn't that big a deal. It's not that big a deal. I mean, when you compare this to all the things he's going to do, when he heals lepers, when he makes the blind see, those are really important things. They ran out of wine at a wedding. Not on that level. Or is it? We're going to talk about that. Mary trusts that he's going to do something anyway. And so she tells the servants to do what he says, and he, I guess to make up for the way he talked to his mother, tells the servants to take these water jars, 20 or 30 gallons each, and so he takes 6 of them. So they're making a point that this is an insane amount of wine. Okay, this is 120 to 180 gallons of water that he's going to turn into wine. All right. It's amazing. But the issue isn't so much the fact that this is enough to get an entire town drunk. The issue, in light of what the steward says when he tastes it, is really to think about the expense. See, the steward, remember the steward, this is the person in charge of the household, okay? Doesn't know where the wine came from. He tastes it. And he does not say, by the way, that this is like the best wine in the history of wine. He simply understands that this is better wine than what they had been serving. So they started serving wine, and however good or bad it was, it doesn't say this wine was better. And so he talks about it in terms of the expense. All right, so he's now looking at 120 to 180 gallons of wine that is better and presumably more expensive than what they had served before, and he is thinking strategically. And in terms of strategy, he says, I don't know, what did you do? This doesn't make sense to me. You served the cheaper stuff first when people would notice, and you saved the good stuff for later, all right? And I don't understand why you would do that. Your reputation would be better if you served the good stuff first, like everyone else would, and you serve the cheaper stuff later. Right? It defies common sense. And so he's interpreting what had happened in terms of what we would refer to as common sense. Now, what is common sense? Common sense, that word common, is simply kind of an assumed, an agreed upon way of looking at the world. It's an agreed upon way of looking at the situations in the world. And what we do is when we say that a person doesn't have common sense, what we're saying is that you're not reacting to the circumstance the way everyone else would. It's not necessarily a value judgment. It often is a value judgment in terms of our, group mentality, group ideas about, wanting to conform to group norms. But it's really about saying you are reacting to the circumstance differently than the group norm would suggest that you should react to it. And common sense forms a framework by which we view the world. So we look at the world and we see everything that happens through the framework of common sense. And that framework ends up actually controlling us and really dictating the way we're going to see everything. Now, this is Martin Luther King weekend, and I always like to quote from his speeches when he does this, on this weekend. And one of the speeches that he gave was in 1967. It was called, "Where Do We Go From Here?" And in it, he talks about foundational change that needs to happen. And he did it by referring to the story of Nicodemus. Okay, so this is Dr. King talking about Nicodemus. And what he says is that Nicodemus came to Jesus and said, what do I need to do to be saved? All right, what do I need to do to be right with God? And what Dr. King says is that Jesus didn't get bogged down on the kind of isolated approach of what you shouldn't do. Jesus didn't say, now Nicodemus, you must stop lying. He didn't say, Nicodemus, now you must not commit adultery. He didn't say, now Nicodemus, you must stop cheating if you are doing that. He said something altogether different because Jesus realized something basic, that if a man will lie, he will steal. And if a man will steal, he will kill. So instead of just getting bogged down on one thing, Jesus looked at him and said, Nicodemus, you must be born again. And the way he unpacked that phrase, Dr. King unpacks born again by saying this. In other words, your whole structure must be changed. The issue wasn't to constrain a particular sin or a list of sins, but rather that what you needed to do was change your structure. Because if you had a propensity to sin, it will come out some other way. If you're willing to lie, you'll steal. If you're willing to steal, you'll kill. It will come out. What you need to do is actually change your foundation. Because surface changes don't last. Surface changes don't last because what's underneath keeps coming through. You have to attack problems at their root. All right. Now, my clutter returns because I have not figured out what the root problem is. All right? There's got to be a root problem in the way I look at stuff, the way I deal with things, the way I handle, mail when it comes in. There's a root problem that is beneath the clutter. So every time I clean up the clutter returns because the problem is deeper. Right? The problem is deeper than the existence of the clutter. And some of you may have made New Year's resolutions. And some of you may have already failed at your New Year's resolutions. Some of you have made the same resolution year after year after year. And the reason why it didn't take was because the resolution was at some kind of surface level and didn't actually deal with what's underneath. Now, a book that I read about almost a decade ago that I really love, and I quote it relatively often, is a book by a New York Times writer named Charles Duhigg. And it was a book called The Power of Habit. And I really recommend this book. And it is a difficult one to follow because he talks to you. He doesn't give you a do step 1, step 2, step 3, but he speaks more conceptually. He speaks more conceptually about what he calls our keystone habits. All right? Keystone habits are things that you do. And they are small changes or habits that people introduce into their routines that carry over into other aspects of their lives. All right? So there are certain habits that you have, certain core habits, and they actually cascade. The effect of them cascades into the other parts of your life. And if you actually want change, you can't change the thing that is, 2 levels down from the keystone habit because it's the keystone habit that's causing that thing to happen 2 levels later. You have to actually discern what the keystone habit is and change that. And when you do that, you see cascading effects all over the place. All right? Certain core things that you may not think are the most important thing actually have huge effects. Like here's one thing that he mentioned that is really important to parents, and it's this. It has to do with the habit of eating dinner together with a family. And he said researchers have shown that families who habitually eat dinner together have children with better homework skills, higher grades, greater emotional control, and more confidence. That those all correlate to a family that eats dinner together regularly. And I was trying to think this through. Does this make sense? And at a certain level, it does. First, there's the discipline of always doing it. This is a discipline. You have to be there. So discipline's a part of it, all right? No matter what, you have to have dinner together. You have to be at the supper table at whatever time your family eats supper. Emotional control, well, I know I had to maintain that at the supper table. All right? Had to have emotional control at the dinner table. More confidence? Yeah, I think so. Because the dinner table also, for the most part, was an affirming place to be. It was my parents talking to me about what happened, how was your day, and generally being supportive and affirming. So it was a time of support and affirmation. So I can see all these other things emanating from this habit, from just this time together. All right? And you may not have thought about it. I mean, if you sat there and said, boy, my kid doesn't like to study and the grades aren't really good, and the school counselor said, well, do you eat dinner together every day? You might be like, what? Does that actually make sense? And yet, here's, there's empirical evidence that would say that it makes a difference. All right? Certain other things in our lives have ramifications that come out elsewhere. I mean, as we consider the life of Dr. King, we all remember this famous picture from American history, right? This is the picture of Rosa Parks on the bus. They recreated this photo, by the way, just because they didn't have an actual photo of her on the bus sitting in the front when she got arrested. So I don't know if you know the story. It's kind of cool. Is that they wanted to get a photo of her on the bus, and then they needed a white guy to sit there and look disinterested, and he's actually a supporter. So he kind of is a famous face that no one knows the name of in history because he's sitting behind Rosa Parks, but they needed, in order to set the context, a picture of her sitting in front of a white guy. So they asked him, who was there for the shoot, to sit on the bus. Okay, and he did it. So it's kind of interesting that he's actually a devoted civil rights supporter who was in that photo. But one thing that gets talked about actually in Charles Duhigg's book, The Power of Habit, because he's talking about how things have ramifications that come up elsewhere, is that Rosa Parks was not the first person in Montgomery arrested for sitting in the front of the bus. It had happened before. It wasn't that uncommon that they would arrest a person for sitting in the front of the bus. And he's like, why did she become the person? Why did the town rally around it? Why did the civil rights movement rally around it? Turned out it was because she was in, like, every social network of African Americans in Montgomery. She was a member of various clubs, various organizations. Everybody knew her. Everybody liked her. And when she got arrested, everybody was like, we have to rally because it's Rosa. It was actually her interpersonal relationships in the African American community in Montgomery that led to this. And the Montgomery bus boycott ended up launching Martin Luther King's career. Because at the time this happened, Dr. King was a young Baptist pastor who had just come to Montgomery. And he had been there for only a year. And what happened was one of the leaders in town called Dr. King and said, we would like to use your church to gather and start to organize, to protest what has happened to Rosa Parks. And Dr. King's response was, let me think about it and I'll get back to you. He actually was not sure that he wanted to do this only a year into his pastorate in Montgomery. And the other leaders talked to him and said, you have to do this because it's Rosa. You can't turn your back on her. She's too well loved in the community. And so he did. And it launched his career. It's kind of amazing how these little things that don't seem related to the core thing end up having such an impact on the core thing. Right? In the story we have today, there are some basic things that Jesus lays down in the story. It's not about the power of turning water into wine. It's that, number one, they end up caring about the host's plight when it wasn't their problem. And secondly, they're generous with the good wine, an incredible amount of good wine that gets served in an anti-common sense position of coming out after the original wine had been served. This ends up being foundational to Jesus' ministry, not the demonstration of power per se, but the context of principles within a situation that we would look at and say isn't necessarily all that important. It's a party that ran out of wine. But he lays a foundation for his ministry of empathy and generosity. Empathy and generosity are the keystone of what Jesus does here, and they're the keystone of what it means to be followers of Christ. We are people who empathize with the problems of others. We don't just say, hey, that's your problem, not mine. I'm affected by it because it's your problem and I care about you. And I'm going to defy common sense with my generosity. See, common sense sets the tone of how to assess a situation. But what if common sense is that you assess every situation in terms of empathy and generosity? What if empathy and generosity become the driving principles of common sense? How far would that go in helping you live the kind of life that Christ wants you to live? If you just looked at every circumstance that you were in through that simple lens of empathy and generosity. And if you do that, if we do that, it can change the world. Dr. King ended his speech where he talked about Nicodemus. Toward the end of that speech, here is what he said. He said, "And I must confess, my friends, that the road ahead will not always be smooth. There will still be rocky places of frustration and meandering points of bewilderment. There will be inevitable setbacks here and there will be those moments when the buoyancy of hope will be transformed into the fatigue of despair. But difficult and painful as it is, we must walk on in the days ahead with an audacious faith in the future." He had an audacious faith, and why did he call it audacious? He called it audacious because what he was saying in this talk was that in order for us to move forward, we needed to make structural change. We needed to make foundational change. As a society, we needed to make foundational changes. As individuals, we need to make foundational changes. We need to take what we consider to be common sense and replace it with a new common sense that is centered around values like empathy and generosity. But the beautiful thing for me about marrying this idea with what Mr. Duhigg talked about with Keystone Habits is that small change can have significant impact when it's the right change. See, the faith can be audacious, that there can be structural change, because really all it takes is relatively small foundational changes, small changes in the right places can have significant, lasting, cascading impact in our lives. Small mindset shifts lead to big changes in our habits. Key relationships, like Rosa Parks had with her community, cascade into big rallies of support. A key relationship that we can develop with Jesus can change our mindsets in some small, fundamental ways. But imagine how vastly different our lives would look if empathy and generosity was the fundamental lens through which we saw everything. So we can have audacious faith in the hope of big change to conform us all to what Christ would have us become. Because it can begin with small change correctly placed, that leads to big effects that endure. Amen.